Okay. Hello and welcome. Welcome everyone to our keynote think tank and town hall. Before we dive into the discussion, I would like to share a couple of announcements and reminders. First, if you're not already a member of Division 56, there are many reasons to consider joining, including access to our high impact journal, webinar trainings available at your convenience for free or a small fee for CEUs, grants supporting projects that center and elevate Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, networking and mentoring opportunities, and the list of benefits just keeps on going. So the membership fee is quite affordable, and you do not need to be an APA member to join. And on this slide, you'll see the link to our website where you can find the Join Us link. You'll also be able to download the slide deck where you access this presentation. So you can, if you don't have time to jot that down, you can also get that there. I also wanted to remind you that we continue to be welcoming submissions for our special issue. And I can't, there we go, no. For a special section for our Division 56 journal, Psychological Trauma, on advancing trauma research, practice, and policy through reciprocal collaborations. We're looking to publish papers on effective collaborations between trauma-focused research, practice, social justice, and/or policy advocacy, and those kinds of collaborations that go beyond the more, sort of typical unidirectional model of translational or implementation science. And articles we're looking for can provide examples of such collaborations, report on outcomes, discuss methodological considerations, and the like. Please email us at this email if you have any questions. And now on to our session, which is co-sponsored by Division 42, and several divisions are co-listing this session, including Divisions 12, 17, 18, 48, and 52. So this is going to be a think tank and town hall, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what that's going to look like. The think tank and town hall is really geared at advancing research, practice, and policy through reciprocal collaborations. And our panelists, Drs. Tama Bryant-Davis, David Bathory, Mary Lynn Cloyter, Anne DePrince, Dean Kilpatrick, and Sheila Rauch, really need little or no introduction. They're all well-known experts in their field, and we're invited to participate in this session because they each have effectively engaged in collaborations that bridge to a more of our psychology arenas like research, practice, social justice, and policy advocacy. And these kind folks have agreed to share some of their successes and lessons learned from some of their cross collaborations. And they'll offer their suggestions of how we might, as a field, as a profession, encourage these kinds of synergistic partnerships more. Indeed, perhaps even make them an expected part of our professional endeavors, including in publishing, awarding grants, developing practice guidelines, etc. In other words, they will engage themselves and engage listeners, us, in thinking about what kinds of practices and policies we might develop that are more inclusive, that include different ways of knowing, that maximize basically our effectiveness at reaching our shared goal of advancing and leveraging psychology, and specifically in trauma psychology for us in Division 56, to improve lives ultimately and for the betterment of society. So as I mentioned, we're also going to be inviting you to join us for a live interactive town hall with our panelists to provide your feedback and suggestions and of your own ideas. And that will be held on August 7th at 11 to 11:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And that on the slide, you'll see the meeting ID and password for Zoom meeting. I should have made that clear on the slide for its first Zoom meeting. And again, like I said, you can get these slides from where you are accessing this presentation in case you don't have time to jot that down right now, but I'll pull it back up again. And then the last piece of information is if you want CEUs for this presentation, along with the follow-up interactive session that I just mentioned, will be available together on our Division 56 home study platform starting around mid-August, as soon as we can get it up there. And here's the link to access that and many other webinars. All right, so without further ado, let me stop sharing at this point and hand the mic off to our panelists. And so I'm going to ask them first to share, like I said, some examples of their cross collaborations and some lessons learned and their successes with that. So I will hand it off first to Dr. Marilyn Cloitre.
Hi there. My name is Mary-Lynn Cloitre, and I work at the National Center for PTSD in Palo Alto, California. And most of my domain bridging work has been between myself as a trauma researcher and highly traumatized communities or populations who've experienced complex trauma. And by that, I mean populations that are typically underserved, minority, and been multiply traumatized. And examples of populations I've worked with are the LGBTQ community here in San Francisco, minority women who live with HIV/AIDS, and the Yazidi women who were abducted by ISIS. And I started thinking about characteristics that my experiences with these groups had in common, which I think made them successful. So these are sort of my personal to-dos. One is be invited rather than invite yourself to the party. And how do you be invited? How are you known so people do invite you? And I realized I'd written articles and books and pamphlets in plain speak about what it means to experience complex trauma. Secondly, as an educator, I've been very supportive of students who have diverse pathways, who don't go the academic route or don't go the clinical route and ultimately find themselves doing something else, but they carry with them hopefully what you've taught them. So for example, my work now with the LGBTQ community came from a student who became an administrator, but remembered all about trauma, and she's very connected to the LGBTQ community, and she invited me. And so that's a start. I think be invited. It really makes a difference when you're coming into community that you don't know that much about. Secondly, when I begin working with the community, I try and be relevant and listen to what they have to say. And often I found that people really don't want to begin with the work or symptoms or diagnoses, but they want to begin with their lived experience, why they've invited you there in the first place. And I think that's the way you begin to build, a relevant relationship with them. I think third is be informed about their culture. I did spend time learning about Yazidi culture before, during, and after my initial work with them, similarly with LGBTQ community. I think at the beginning, especially if you're invited, you get a pass about not knowing things, but after a while, it's not going to work anymore, and you really need to immerse yourself in full understanding of the culture and its history, I think, in order to be an effective collaborator. Fourth, I think it's important to, when you begin doing research, be very collaborative and listen very well to the needs of the community you're working with. So for example, I had the pleasure and the honor of working with the WHO in the development of ICD-11, PTSD, and complex PTSD. And we were asked, to develop some measures. And when I spoke to clinicians, I said, well, we need to develop something that's probably 20 items to capture these two diagnoses. And the clinician, I could tell by the sort of strength of his jaw, he said, I won't use it. if it's not 12 or less, I'm not going to use it. So one, I listened to what he said, and two, I realized I didn't have the skill set to do what was needed. So it was important to be collaborative, and I invited people who know about measurement and instrument development and said, is this possible? Can we do it? So I think this bridging work requires us to really recognize that we need to work in a group. And in terms of methodologies that are valuable in these kinds of collaborations, community-based collaborations, I think, you know, the work that's emerging in mixed methods is very important, where you can almost see transparently that the quantitative data that we collect through surveys kind of represents our tradition. The qualitative work that we're beginning to do in interviewing allows us to understand better new features of the people we're working with. And you can do it either way. You can begin with your quantitative work and then move to the qualitative interviewing. How can I understand these data that we found? Or reverse, begin qualitatively doing interviews and then develop measures or bring in traditional measures that are already established to make things work. So I think, you know, being curious about and developing new methodologies to match the kind of bridging you're doing is important. And I think lastly, you know, these communities have very few resources, have other priorities. And so I think in the long run, you also have to be ready for the long haul. So those are my thoughts. Be invited, be relevant, be informed, be collaborative, and be ready for the long haul. That's it.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And next, I'd like to call up Dr. Sheila Rauch.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for putting this together, Carolyn. I am going to share a slide. I'm, I guess, very ambitious today, and I'm trying this. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Great. Great. So I'm going to be talking today about two specific collaborations that I've been involved in actually over time. Actually many times. One type of collaboration, reciprocal collaboration I've been involved in, example will be when I bind my research knowledge and program development in working with an established clinic. So that was in clinic redesign for the PTSD clinic in Ann Arbor. And then I'm also going to talk a little bit about the development of PE primary care, which was a collaboration between primary care providers and my research background and experience there. So I wanted to start just by presenting kind of my primary goal as career goal, I guess, would be to get the treatments that work to people who need them at the place where they can receive them and at the time when they're going to engage with care. So anytime that I'm doing my clinical, administrative, or research roles or training roles, I'm engaging in 4 different types of activities. One is I'm observing to see what providers, patients, systems, and communities are doing so that I can learn from what's already there, especially looking for what's working and what problems are they reporting. Then the next step is related to that. I'm listening to the system, to the patients, to the providers, the communities, and the systems to see what they want. What are they saying they need to improve, or what are the gaps in care that they're recognizing? What are the obstacles to each of those components getting what they need? And then also I'm listening for facilitators and resources. So where are the places where we may have some extra resources that we can use to accomplish our shared goals? And then I'm also looking for what do they see as the problems in care. The third thing that I'm looking for is where can we simplify? A lot of my work is involved in getting access. So we have some really good treatments within PTSD and within trauma work, but most of them require specialized mental health providers to administer them. And that's a huge obstacle to the people who need those interventions actually getting what they need. So trying to simplify and get it down to ways that we can get the treatments to the patients, get the treatments to the providers, the training to the providers, the training and treatments out to the communities, and simplifying is that big piece. And then I'm looking for where can we act? Where can we take advantage of opportunities that come up with an eye towards sustainability and towards reciprocal benefit? So what are the things we can do together, the goals that we can engage in together? So one example of this was redesigning the PTSD clinic in Ann Arbor. When I joined the VA in Ann Arbor in 2005, the clinic had a 6-month wait list for assessment, and it would be another 3 to 6 months before you could get treatment. And the treatment was mostly supportive therapy at that point. So when they hired me to try and bring some evidence-based assessment and treatment into the clinic. And working within that system, talking with the providers, talking with the administrators, talking with everybody over 2 years of incremental change and building relationships, we were able to take that intake process, make changes to the intake process, kind of trimming it down, making it more focused, changing the scheduling and administrative systems, training the providers, and then implementing a new system that 2 years later, patients could call the clinic and get an assessment within 2 weeks and get treatment that next week. With evidence-based psychotherapies and lots of options for evidence-based psychotherapies for PTSD. So that was a very successful, I would say, reciprocal collaboration between all of the team members, the administrators, and the providers. The other example I had is PE primary care, where when we started to develop this treatment, it was again trying to get the treatments to the patients instead of waiting for patients to come to specialty mental health. And so we went to the primary care providers and said, who are your most difficult patients? Who's causing the most trouble? Who doesn't follow through? And as it turns out, those patients tended to be people who had histories of trauma or other issues. And so we were able to help them deal with the problem that they had by talking with them about how to develop this treatment, how to make it brief, how to have it fit into the primary care setting, instead of having the setting have to modify for the treatment. And it ended up being a treatment that patients now have access to effective PTSD care in primary care. They get really good remission rates, and providers are happy because their patients are happy and they follow through on care. So I'll stop now. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And next I'll call Dr. Tema Bryant-Davis.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Dr. Tema Bryant-Davis, and I am a professor of psychology at Pepperdine University and director of the Culture and Trauma Research Lab. Along with being a trauma researcher, I'm also a practitioner, a policy advocate, and a survivor. When I enter into the work of trauma psychology, it really is important that we take a liberation psychology perspective or decolonizing psychology perspective, which means that we do not decontextualize people, that it is not just a matter of individual traumas occurring and how we respond to that, but that people are living victimized, violated, and recovering in a context of multiple systems. So in order to truly shift and create change, there is a need not only for individual intervention, but policy advocacy so that there can be systemic change. And we are not just working in the aftermath of trauma, but in a preventative way, and also trying to have real world solutions that can reach many. And so I have been blessed to have the opportunity to do policy advocacy both globally and locally. I was among the American Psychological Association's first representatives to the United Nations. And now more locally, I live in Los Angeles, and I'm elected member of our neighborhood city council, which is the liaison between the neighborhood and the city council members that represent districts with more than one city or neighborhood under their jurisdiction. And so learning about doing policy advocacy as a psychologist, it was important for me to recognize that many times psychology is left off the table, and not really out of a disrespect or a maliciousness, but often a lack of awareness. And so much of the dialogue at the United Nations was centered around health, physical health in terms of safety and sustainable development, and then largely around the law. So there was a big effort to be aware of what laws different nation states had, and then what was being done in order to help people to have food to eat, to keep them safe from violence, but not a lot of awareness about the mental health implications of particular policies or the mental health consequences. And so being at the table is an important part of the process. And I learned very quickly the importance of collaboration. In a neighborhood council or at the United Nations, there are many organizations that want to advocate for their particular issue or their particular population, but we increase our impact when we are combined or collaborative with other organizations. So if instead of just saying, I represent APA, if I can say that I represent this global coalition of health and mental health organizations, then that has a much better chance of being heard. We also learned very quickly the importance of being succinct, and we know we can be long-winded in our research in terms of building the argument, but succinct and without jargon. Often when we only talk with each other, we're not even aware of the amount of jargon that we use, and that people are not really being able to comprehend the fullness of what we're sharing. And so being able to distill a body of research in a way that people who are outside of the field can truly understand it is very important. Also getting a sense of learning the culture and the system, so we understand the different voices that are at the table and the ways in which decisions are made. And many times there are meetings before the meetings. And so really becoming assertive and engaged, but engaged with a sense of cultural humility, and also very much tuned into issues of power, privilege, and oppression, recognizing that whether you're at a neighborhood council or at the UN, that there is power at play and privilege at play, and figuring out what that means in terms of your professional identity as well as your personal identity. And recognizing, for me, some of the successes that I was able to see at the United Nations. The group of representatives that I was there serving with we were one of the few groups that were able to be successful in actually getting mental health language in the outcomes documents. So when there are conventions at the UN, what you're trying to do is there are outcome documents that all of the member states have to agree on. So seeing consensus building at play, and it can be as simple as wherever we see physical health, asking them to add physical and mental health, and going from nation to nation to see is there someone who is willing to speak for us, because as a non-governmental organization, we are not allowed to speak on the floor of the convention, but we can approach different nations and have them present our issue to the group and speak support for it. So we were successful at the UN Convention Against Racism, religious intolerance, and xenophobia to get language around psychology and mental health on the table. A more recent success, now that I'm working with the Neighborhood Council here in Los Angeles, is I am the chairperson for the Education Committee. And so dealing with the aftermath of COVID and seeing, or the continuing trauma of COVID, our medical pandemic, is seeing teachers being affected, parents being affected, and students being affected. And so getting the Los Angeles Public School representatives to place on their websites and on Facebook education about coping with COVID for teachers, for parents, and for children has been critical in getting that word out, because so many people are hurting. There is great science that we have created, but if it remains in the academy and we are only getting to read it to each other, it really has minimal impact. But to have significant impact, even beyond an individual session, but to create societal change, it's important for psychologists to consider getting involved in policy advocacy. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And next I'll call up Dr. Dean Kilpatrick.
Well, thank you very much. I'm Dean Kilpatrick, and I'm at the Medical University of South Carolina, the National Crime Victims Research and Treatment Center. Well, my story started out noticing barriers when I, as a volunteer, joined People Against Rape, Rape Crisis Center, feminist, the only male founder of the center a long time ago. And one of the things that we noticed is that there's a lot of misinformation about rape, and people needed statistics. They needed information about how it affects people, what it's like, what are the myths, and what's the correct information. And there was not a lot out there. One of the things that I was taught in graduate school as a researcher is that it was promiscuous to not transmit your information and your data via scientific peer-reviewed publications, that there was just something wrong with people who took another route. I mean, not to suggest that you shouldn't publish, but that if you only publish, just as the last speaker was mentioning, can pretty well guarantee you that only a special few who are in your tribe will know anything that's there, because you might as well declare something top secret as put it in a publication in terms of having any general impact in the world. So working in the anti-rape trauma field for a long time, we knew that there was more information that was needed. And so we got a large NIDA grant to study a national sample of women over time and to measure their exposure to various kinds of traumatic events, including sexual violence. And we had some pretty interesting data, and we were going to publish it, but we decided, how can we have this have somewhat of a greater impact? So what I wound up doing was collaborating with some colleagues at something at the time that was called the National Victim Center. It used to be the Sonny von Bülow Center. And what their expertise was in taking things that were very complicated, that were relevant to people who worked with rape victims and public policy people, and turn it into something that they could understand. So we collaborated on doing a report and a press conference. And the report was called Rape in America, a report to the nation. And it included data from the National Women's Study, over 4,000 women. And it also included a survey of people from over 800 rape crisis centers all across the country. We combined it into, this is my high-tech presentation here, this document, which is pretty. It's kind of has graphs. It has shows things, and it's written not for scientists, but for regular people. And these are the authors, and you'll note that I'm one of them, but the other two people are communication specialists who worked at the National Victim Center. So what happened? We had a press conference due to their ability to draw the press at the National Press Club, and you can't see much of that, but it's a lot of people who showed up. And as a result of presenting that and having people from the advocacy community there as well, within 10 days, there were 113 million press impressions, meaning that it was all over the print media as well as the electronic media. And it really got out there in a way that nothing else could have done if we just published. What we then did, though, is that we did publish a lot of papers, but I looked it up today, and this document has been cited over 1,000 times in the scientific literature. And that's something that would not have happened had we turned that into a indigestible publication that no one else had known about. So what lessons do I take from this? One of the lessons is that you really do get further if you collaborate. We collaborated with a survey research firm to collect the data. We collaborated with victim advocates and a crime victims organization and rape crisis centers in order to get the information out there. We wrote this together, which meant that I was saying things like, well, 27% of the rape victim, women who'd ever been raped, it was before they were age 11, which is a startling statistic. My colleague, Ann Seymour, who helped write the book, said, rape in America is a tragedy of youth. Which of those do you think got cited? So anyway, what my advice is to do better as psychologists in getting the word out there. We do need to collaborate more. We also need to translate what we do into understandable terms. We also need to get involved in policy work. And interestingly, I found out that most policymakers actually get their ideas and information from USA Today and, God forbid, Fox News and MSNBC. They get it there more than they do going down and trying to read journals. So collaboration, I think, is the key, and having the courage to get out there and violate maybe some of our professional norms by using media, including social media, to get our message out there. Thank you.
Thank you. And next up, I will call up Dr. Anna Prince.
Hello, thank you so much for this opportunity. Like many of my esteemed colleagues, my motivation for this kind of reciprocal work came from wanting to do science that mattered and wanting to do science that had an impact. And in particular, I was really invested in the idea that the science my team was doing could have an impact in community-based victim services. And so when I arrived at the University of Denver, where I'm a professor of psychology, and where today I also direct the University Center for Community Engagement to advance scholarship and learning, I started building relationships out in the community, trying to figure out what kinds of questions would be useful to have research data-related answers for community agencies. And what I started learning over time was a way to marry, if you will, the questions that community partners were saying they needed help answering with the expertise and the learning they were willing to share with us, with my team, and then also with our research team's goal of driving forward our program of research. And I came to see that win-win, that the research team gets something, we do something to contribute to science, we elevate multiple forms of expertise and answer questions that can have an impact in the community, that not only was a joy and an inspiration to do that sort of work, but also that there's a whole tradition of that kind of approach called community engaged research. And so my team has continued to try to learn from other disciplines who commonly use community engaged methods to stick with that approach. For example, we're currently doing a study that has a strong basic science component, asking questions about domestic violence and traumatic brain injury, at the same time that we're trying to answer questions for a family justice center about practice implications and how and when they might screen for TBI in their intake process, and what information that can offer them as they help to provide, try to provide the best possible services to survivors. And that has led us in some unexpected and interesting directions, that when trying to be responsive to community questions and needs, we've ended up stretching beyond the places I started as a psychologist. So I've learned a lot about the criminal legal system and the civil legal system, and have been involved in collaborations where we try to bring a psychology lens to answering questions about how survivors navigate those kinds of complex systems, and what kinds of programs, community-based partners can build up to help and support survivors in their goals. That sort of work has led to, we did the research that was the foundation for what is now the Legal Information Network of Colorado, or LINC, and we continue to be involved in that project in an ongoing way to help them refine and use data in the evolution of that program. And I think, to echo some of what's come up, what has worked well and been particularly surprising and rewarding has been really leaning into the aspects of community engaged practice that emphasize making sure that you're delivering products back to all of your stakeholders. So scientists are part of our stakeholders, grantors, and grant reports, and then we put on the same level of importance creating documents for the community. So we have a blog newsletter now where we every month or two send out updates on our research. Our team has started to do op-ed writing to share findings more broadly, and we've had community convenings. And so the win-win here is also that my team and I together are learning how to communicate not just to scientists, but to the broader public. And that next generation piece of helping graduate students be prepared to have that sort of impact has been an extraordinarily important piece for me. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And then last but not least, I'm going to ask Dr. David Bathory to share his experiences and lessons learned.
Hi, yes. The type of work I've been doing for many years has really focused on trying to come up with a theory that would help create cooperative relationships from non-cooperative. And in doing that, I started to do some work with probably some more oppressed populations, and I've been doing that for years, whether they're people who have mental health issues that are pretty much voiceless within the system, or in particular transgender people. But there's been a variety of different groups I've worked with. And I sort of picked up a whole group of different theories that were things from psychology, trauma, neurobiology, biological evolution, and even got into mathematical models, which I'm not a mathematician, but picked up on some work that was done by John Nash years ago, and came up with a way of looking at relationships that looked at acceptance in particular and dominance as two drives that tend to influence the way we make decisions within a relationship. And in doing so, I started to do some work in particular with some other countries around trauma originally. And it was with, on all things, a paper on rural tourism for a conference in Romania about flooding and how people could master and control the effects of flooding and trauma. And that led to me to begin a relationship with them over time. And in doing so, I guess it's been probably maybe 7 years at least. I've been invited back for multiple different conferences and discussions, and became involved in a project where they're reorganizing their healthcare system. Ironically, they asked me to do a paper on a proposal of how to possibly better the system. And one of the points that I started to look at was the European Union's requirements for different countries to meet, since they're part of the European Union. And they were the only country that did not report any transgender people existing in their country. So when I went in and was speaking with them, I knew this was a point that was going to be not easy. And initially, I was very concerned that if I brought it up, I also might not be invited back, because I knew it was going to be a spot that they weren't comfortable discussing. But as it turned out, being able to utilize some of the principles of the theory that I've worked on allowed us to sort of negotiate things back and forth so that at least we had an understanding of why this was important and why it should be addressed. And for many people, the most important part of any type of relationship like this is keeping the conversation going. Because if If you're invited in for something, but you're not invited back, conversation is over. So that would be one of the big lessons that I've learned. You want to keep the conversation going. You also want to do things as looking at what they need versus what they want, because very often there's a conflict between the two. I may need something very desperately in an organization or a country or a project, but I may also not be wanting it to happen. And very often you have to figure out ways to negotiate on the side of what you actually need. And in that becomes a very collaborative kind of, almost like what I would describe a dance. I look at people doing things from the basis of we have to have trust to begin with, and that takes a long time to establish, and it's based on your behavior and your reactions to other people's behaviors. And then you move more towards things like their purpose, their very often their passions, and then on the other end, it gets into more things of really altruistic type of interests, which is a great way to re-engage people in these kind of conversations when it's something that's very controversial, touchy. I think the last part of it is really that the relationship remains respectful at all times. And if it ever reaches the point where it's not respectful any longer, then one of the two parties should really step out and let things cool down a bit, and then step back in with the explanation of why they felt they had to step out. Because again, for it to be a cooperative relationship, if any of the groups gets to the point where they're not able to listen any longer, it's not a working relationship. So that theory, or that way I work, has been utilized in multiple different settings. I do that within therapy. I've done it with individuals who were evaluated for commitment, with domestic violence perpetrators, people who have been in prison. So I've done it with individuals as well as with groups. And again, it's one of these things that seems to just fit and work as long as you keep trying. So, thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay, so I think that it would be great to move now towards at least initiating a discussion between all of us on some recommendations, some thoughts you might have about developing recommendations for our field, for our profession, in terms of moving forward to sort of make these kinds of collaborative efforts more common, more expected parts of what we do, and more, I guess, the norm. So what are some thoughts that you have about this? So
I think Tima is talking on mute. Yeah, sorry.
Yes, thank you. From the standpoint of training and education, I think starting to consider assignments that integrate policy implications. So when we're assigning research papers, we often will say to talk about clinical implications, but to also get students in the practice of looking at policy implications. And even when we assign assignments for venturing out, often in clinical training, students are recommended to go attend an AA group and see what that experience is like. I would say it would be valuable to attend a city council meeting. And of course, now in the times we're in, a lot of the meetings are online and they're open to the public. And so to see how those discussions take place, to see how decisions are made, the dialogue before voting, what that looks like, and then starting to also get in the habit of how would I explain this to someone who was not in the academy. That often when I've taken students into our community here in South Central Los Angeles, predominantly African American and Latino, when we're first practicing, they sound like they're giving a class presentation. And I have to say, now say it again like you're explaining it to your grandmother. So just getting in the practice of talking very plainly about these concepts so that everyone can benefit.
Love it.
Yeah, this is sounds simple, but it probably isn't. But it might be good to require or to try to get journals in the habit of requiring people, maybe this would not be for publication, maybe it would, but to provide a brief synopsis about why should anybody who's not a pointy-headed intellectual academic care about something like this. I mean, does it have any clinical implications? Does it have any policy implications? Does it have, you know, just, is there something about this research that would be of interest to people, you know, who are not academicians?
At my institution, we've tried to emphasize helping colleagues understand that best practices for this kind of collaborative work are multiple sorts of products. So just as we would evaluate the journal articles that come out of a project or future grants that are the result of a project, connecting the dots for tenure and promotion and review, annual review committees to understand that blogging or op-eds, the kinds of reports that Dean mentioned, that these are not charity, these are not creative asides from the real work. These are part of the best practices of the real work. And that even if our colleagues never use these methods themselves, finding ways to educate them has been a really crucial part of work at my institution, both within and outside my department.
I would build on what everyone is saying here already, and in just emphasizing how important it is for people throughout your career to continue to touch base with those community organizations, with the policy organizations, with the people outside of our academic institutions. You know, as someone who writes lots of grants and papers and stuff, it's easy to just sink into that and not leave the four walls of your academic office. But if we really want to make change in the community and have an impact on our world, we have to be out there regularly and over again, and reshaping our academic thoughts based on what we're learning from the community, and taking our academic stuff out to the community so that they can, you know, learn it in the language that they can hear it. So.
I think another thing that I would say is that probably the best personal experience that I had, you know, academically, was serving in a feminist-oriented collective grassroots rape crisis center, in which everything was done by consensus. No major decision could be made. It took forever to get anything done. But then once people had agreed to things, you didn't have to turn around. You railroad, you got a 4-3 vote, you win your vote, and then the three are trying to undo everything else that went on. And as a white male professional, that was not at the hierarchy of you know, for a feminist grassroots rape crisis center. So me being in a minority was a very good thing for me to listen and learn about experiences that other people have had, and actually getting involved in some of these community-based organizations is great experience that will actually help you academically, more so maybe than being on the you know, the second tier of the promotions committee or something like that. But we do need to educate academia about how valuable these things are, and you know, so that it's appreciated at promotion time.
These are wonderful, wonderful sort of suggestions and thoughts. And do you have any ideas about, I mean, what are your thoughts about if we were to, you know, come up with these kinds of recommendations, almost like these expectations? What are your thoughts about what that would be like and how that would be received, like by journal publishers? And we said, you know, why can we just also add, you know, you already have this requirement for clinical implications. Can we add policy implications, or approaching, you know, sort of leaderships in academia and, you know, promotion sort of committees, and asking them to sort of be think more broadly in terms of what a promotion package could entail. What are your ideas and your thoughts about how receptive these different sort of folks would be?
I think we would definitely have to make a case for it, especially those things that are around training and supervision, because many faculty members were never required to do these things and perhaps have never done them themselves. So if I say, for example, it will be beneficial to attend a city council meeting and they've never been, then there's going to be pushback about why would I need to go there? What does that have to do with psychology? So I think it would require the education, not just kind of the mandate, but the rationale and how it benefits the field and benefits the larger society. And some of it may be at first elective, you know, when we think about what are options that you can include in your curriculum if you, or in your syllabus, if you're wanting to develop this capacity for your students, or you have students who are interested. So some of it may start from that standpoint.
I would add to that I think in some, I've been in lots of different institutions over my career, including different universities and government, and thinking about each of those, I think it would be a different recipe for each of them. And some, it might be an easy change. Some are already starting in this road. And others, it's going to be a pretty heavy lift. Like you were saying, people that, you know, they never did this before. So how are they going to implement a new training program in an already tight schedule, you know, those sorts of things. So I think we need to be thinking about where we can make the most change and show the benefits, so that those other places that are the outliers that maybe not be sold so easily can see the fruits of our labor and actually be sold on moving in this direction. I think the clinical implications piece in journals started that way. Like the very clinically oriented journals have had that much longer, and now some of the more biological even journals are starting to add those things in, and that might be an idea anyway for how to move it through the whole field.
Mm-hmm. Find the low-hanging fruit.
I also wonder if it's not partially our responsibility to really change the way we educate psychologists. In particular, the role that we've had. It's been, I know my experience has been much more the idea that you were an individual practitioner or an academic versus an agent of change. And I think when I look at some other countries, like in particular like Italy, where they have family systems that's become a political organization, there's different roles that psychologists can get involved in and expand. And maybe it's expanding outside of the realms of academic journals and into more media, more different kinds of venues where our voices are heard. Because I think we are the advocates for many populations that other people don't hear.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts, recommendations, ideas about sort of receptivity and how to go about making maybe like small changes at a time?
I think also being role models for and speaking to students about the benefits of being interdisciplinary or having multiple outlets, because the norm in the field is very much like either or. And if you're doing multiple things, that somehow you're unfocused or scattered. And so then there is a promotion of this idea you need to choose. Like, you can't work with adults and kids. Who are you working with? You can't be a clinician and a researcher. What are you going to be? So to really take on very directly letting our students know that it is possible, that it is welcome, that there is mentorship available, and that one can feed into the other so that we can change this false dichotomy of which one are you.
Mm-hmm. I really like that idea of giving students more options than what we've traditionally done. I know that at my program in grad school, like, if anybody wanted to do any clinical work, they basically had to hide and be secretive about it because it was really highly shunned. And I know there are other schools like that, and I know that's changing, but I think that we don't have to limit ourselves to research or clinical. It could be, a whole handful of other things. And in fact, I think we'll be more effective as a group if we sort of realize that we have to sort of take a more systemic approach and more multi-pronged approach. So what I'd like to do now is just remind folks about the interactive session that we would like to have to continue the conversation and to let me pull it up. I can't multitask apparently here, so I'm just going to pull up the slide to remind folks how they can join us to continue the conversation, where we'll sort of I'll sort of summarize what we talked about today to capture everything, and folks can you can all contribute in case I've misrepresented anything or forgotten anything in terms of the key lessons learned, the key sort of effective strategies to engage in cross-collaborative work, and also recommendations of or that we might make to certain entities to encourage this kind of work. And then we'd love to hear from anybody who'd like to provide feedback on anything they've heard or additional suggestions, so that we can hopefully end up with a product, some ideas and some ways to sort of move forward. So please join us on August 7th, 11 to 11:30 a.m. Eastern time to continue this conversation. We look forward to talking with you all. Do any of you have any final thoughts to sort of hold us until then? All right, well, thank you so much. It's been wonderful, and I can't wait to continue the conversation. Until then, take care, take very good care of yourselves.
Thank you for the invitation. It's been a real pleasure listening to everyone speak.